can get right to the meat of things, which is what we're here for. So welcome everybody. I'm going to turn it over to Heather and Jesse. Again, this is the right to food, a teach-in on the right to food, and this meets pretty much all of our event priorities just across the board. So we're so excited to have them here, and I'm excited to just be here and learn more as well and meet many of you coming today. So Heather and Jesse, take it away.
Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and share screen then. Give me a thumbs up, Andy. Does that look okay? You can hear me? All right, cool. All right, go ahead. We're gonna introduce ourselves, but Heather's gonna introduce the thing, and then we'll take it from there.
Thanks, Jesse. Thanks, Annie. Good morning, everyone. My name is Heather Redberg. I'm a farmer talking with you today from Quills End Farm in Penobscot in Hancock County. I'm here with Jesse Watson, my friend and longtime colleague in food sovereignty advocacy from Rockland, the county seat in Knox County. We'll introduce each other more fully in a few minutes, but first, we want to introduce you to what I consider a beautiful piece of legal poetry, now enshrined in the Declaration of Rights in Maine's Constitution. We'll be sharing the first ever teach-in on Maine's right to food over the next few hours, and just look forward to sharing our experiences, our insights, hearing yours, and a robust discussion afterwards. Thank you to the Maine Food Convergence for inviting us today, and to all of you for showing up to learn about the right to food. We're here to share the fundamentals of the right to food in Maine, what it is, why we need it, ways to exercise this right, and a few ideas for potential policy implementations. We'll be painting in broad brushstrokes, as this is a 15-year-long effort, building movement networks of advocates across the state, from our communities outward, within our state house, and eventually across the country. And I just am really happy to recognize a couple of people are here from the National Right to Food Community of Practice, and really glad to see those colleagues here today. Along the way, we'll look back a little bit to move forward, sharing also the context and history of the food sovereignty movement as it happened on the ground, how it coalesced, and where we are now, including, importantly, enshrining a inherent, natural, unalienable right to food in our state's constitution, the first of its kind in the nation. We'll share how this work grew from local to state to national levels, and some ideas for you to engage at each of those levels moving forward. And most importantly, for the teach-in today, we'll share the language of the Right to Food Amendment with you, its definitions, and the drafter's intent. So I would now like to introduce you to Article 1, Section 25 of Maine's Declaration of Rights, the right to food. In November of 2021, Mainers voted to enshrine the right to food in the state's constitution, the first of its kind in the nation. We'd like to begin by giving you a moment to really read these words, digest them fully, and savor them a little bit. We're moving through this slideshow like a meal. And we really want to give you these moments to just savor these words before we come to talk about them and how they came to be and how we can use them. For audio learners, we'll play the language from our 2021 campaign commercial next for you all to listen to. But for visual learners, I'm going to be still for a full minute now to allow you all to read the text together in silence. From the voices of the movement, this is the language of the right to food.
Right to food.
All individuals have a natural, inherent, and unalienable right to food,
including the right to save and exchange seeds,
and the right to grow, raise,
harvest, produce, and consume the food of their own choosing for their
own nourishment, sustenance, bodily health, and well-being.
As long as an individual does not commit
trespassing, theft, poaching, or other abuses of
private property rights, public lands,
or natural resources in the harvesting, production,
or acquisition of food.
Right to food.
Sorry. So, I hope you like that poetry. So what this slide shows is that all counties across the state passed the right to food with between 50 and 68% of people voting in favor. And I'm given to understand that politicians like to call that a landslide victory. And okay, cool. While that's worth celebrating, you should all know that we've lost more than we've won over the years. And we're not going to get into necessarily all the blow-by-blow details, but it's worth noting at the outset that while this momentous victory is worth celebrating, it also came at the cost of many losses. And that's because we adapted and we kept going. So before we, get into the whole big thing of the slideshow, we'd like to introduce ourselves to you. So I'll introduce Heather. Heather Retberg is farmer over to Quills End Farm in Penobscot, which she stewards along with her family. At Quills End, the farming philosophy is simple: all flesh is grass, all grass is soil. Additionally, she's served as a lead advocate for food sovereignty in Maine to protect legal space for traditional foodways and to ensure the right to food. She co-authored and advocated for local ordinances to ensure food sovereignty and food freedom that have now been adopted by nearly a third of Maine's municipalities. She also co-authored and advocated, organized toward the passage of the Maine Food Sovereignty Act, which was enacted by Maine's legislature in 2017, which recognized local control over food exchanges. She co-authored Maine's constitutional amendment, now Article 25 of Maine's Declaration of Rights, enshrining the right to food in the first state constitution in the country. She worked for 6 years toward its passage in the state legislature and was the principal officer of the Right to Food for Maine campaign when it went to Maine's ballot in 2021. She's worked intensively with her local and state granges toward collaboratively rebuilding agricultural infrastructure and cultural historical knowledge about food and farming. She serves on the board of Food for Maine's Future and is the principal organizer of Local Food Rules, which promotes a revolution in thinking and action about who should control our local food systems. She is also a founding member of the National Right to Food Community of Practice. You got to unmute yourself, Heather.
I'm happy to introduce to you Jesse Watson, a permaculture designer, teacher, and builder living and working in Rockland, Maine. He operates Midcoast Permaculture Design, serving residential farming and institutional clients. He helps facilitate permaculture design certificate courses with the Maine Ecological Design School in MOFGA. He also serves on the board of Food for Maine's Future and has been active in promoting permaculture design in service to agroforestry conservation practices on the farm and at home. He was instrumental in passing a locally binding food sovereignty ordinance in his town in May of 2018 and has consulted and strategized with neighboring food sovereignty advocates. His vision is agroecological in nature. He feels that food sovereignty ordinances set the stage for small-scale distributed food production systems. This idea asserts that local citizens, residents, consumers, and producers are the correct decision makers to design appropriate food systems. Watson likes to envision forest gardens in every backyard with reinvigorated home economies. Now that we have introduced ourselves, we'd like you all to get to know each other so we can get a sense of who's here with us in the Zoom room. There'll be about a 5-minute breakout. And if you can just spend about a minute each on introductions, just share your name, where you're from, and why are you interested in this topic? What brought you here today?
Cool. Okay, so welcome back, everybody. That's us. That's you. Yay. You introduced yourselves. Let's see what's next. All right. We have a narrative arc, if you can't tell yet, that we'd like to present as a basis for common understanding. And we're going to have a very engaging, I'm sure, interactive, participatory discussion at the end. Feel free to put your questions in the chat. The tech team will collect them for our discussion afterwards. But as we go along, we'd invite you to consider these questions in your mind while we give our talk. So in the back of your mind, just contemplate this. How do we exercise the right to food? What might be some violations of the right to food? How do we protect this right, promote, fulfill, respect this right? And what understanding of the right to food are you hoping to take away from this session? So we think it would be good for NGO folks who work in the nonprofit space, who are working in the food system, to know a little bit more about the particulars of the right to food and how rights-based laws function differently than regulatory frameworks of law. We've seen the democratic process work very effectively with a combination of grassroots and legislative work, incorporating volunteer advocates, political champions, and NGO support actors. At this point, it's important to know that passing a food sovereignty ordinance in every town is still necessary. This whole thing works through multiple scales of governance. There are local, state, national, and international aspects. The right to food is integrated across governmental branches, executive, legislative, and judicial. That is to say, it's integrated across agencies, statute, and the courts that interpret and enforce. So our objectives today is to kind of like set this table for you all and put out some place settings and show you who's been at the table so far. This table that we've built ourselves. And once we've kind of prepared this meal, then we'll eat it together and we'll get into the meat and potatoes of it. And then we'll give you a takeout bag at the end so you can take some of this stuff home and continue to use it in your work.
To understand where we are now and how we got here, we have to look back a little ways and connect our work to those who have come before us, finding the thread legislatively, but also recognizing that many have poked at the two-headed policy monster of hunger and Maine's drastic loss of farms in the last 100 years. These are often siloed policies, departmentalized and compartmentalized in ways that are not constructive to good outcomes for either farmers or people living in food security. We all need to eat to live. In the last decade and a half since I put my oar in these waters, while we were working toward the state recognition of food sovereignty and enshrining the right to food, there were a half dozen other legislative bills that were introduced to do one or the other. Some bills passed and others did not, but importantly, the statewide discussion was shifting. The two disparate policy realms were being constructively and purposely intersected. So a deeper and fuller understanding in statute was carefully being constructed to both end hunger and support small-scale farming, local and regional food systems. We were slowly building a house of food resilience. In the years from 2011 to 2021, some of the walls of that house that were constructed were some of the bills that passed mandated that Maine's institutions, for example, buy an increasing percentage of food from Maine's farms, that the state prioritize food self-sufficiency, that the state agencies work together to end hunger by 2030, that edible landscaping employing permaculture principles be designed for the Capitol complex. And please note for later, as we go through this story, these were all put forth by then Representative Craig Hickman. They represent not a sort of a smattering of food policy, but a cohesive effort over time to build a sound house. So many of you probably know that Maine imports more than 90% of our food. Our transportation and distribution costs are high. We're at the end of the line in terms of fuel and food supply chains, energy. That 90% represents to me our vulnerability to external shocks and disruptions of all kinds, storms, pandemic, political pressure. So while our house of food resilience has some important walls in place, it needs a solid foundation. The statutes that I just mentioned can be repealed. Without a foundation, houses collapse. Even while we were working so hard through our state legislature to erect every one of those walls through the legislative process, there was still little resilience to absorb external shocks. Administrations change, the party in control changes, legislative agendas shift in the wind, funding gets withheld, or agencies simply don't follow statutory mandates. So we needed a strong foundation. Enshrining a human right to adequate food in our state constitution was an increasingly essential foundation to put in place to work toward a lasting food resilience. We often said during the campaign, the right to food is a foundation. From there, let us build. So there are two key stories that I just want to share to illustrate how those walls can really blow over without that foundation in place. And the first is the story of the statewide Maine Food Policy Council. It was one example of a strong legislative direction that was very swiftly undone, a legislative wall that was painstakingly built, but collapsed with strong changing winds. So it was enacted into statute in 2006 by Senator Nutting from Androscoggin. It established a statewide food policy council that was tasked with, and I just want to quote this language to you because I think you'll hear the resonance with the eventual amendment of the right to food. It's, quote, food policy for the state that recognizes that is in the best interest of the state to ensure the availability of an adequate supply of safe, wholesome, and nutritious food to all citizens, and with developing a strategic plan for implementation. And I just want to note the words here, especially available, adequate, safe, and nutritious, and also all citizens, and just kind of ask you to hold on to these. In this legislative thread, it's a holding on to from 2006 to 2021. But for our purposes today, just for a few minutes, kind of keep those words in the back of your mind. So local leaders were placed on this council, and also stakeholders from across Maine's food system set to work to make it a reality. However, in 2011, a new administration came into office with a different legislative priority, along with the new legislature, and the legislation establishing the Maine Food Policy Council was repealed, terminating the council and its work. So it was just a big whoosh, one strong wind, and this wall, an established law, fell, and with it, years of work. In Another thing that laid the groundwork for us realizing the need for a foundation of a constitutional amendment was a 2010 federal court case. The FDA in this court case stated that individuals do not have an explicit right to consume or feed any particular food, or notably a right to bodily and physical health, stating that there is no absolute right to consume or feed children any particular food. There is no deeply rooted historical tradition of unfettered access to foods of all kinds, and also the assertion of a fundamental right to their own bodily and physical health is unavailing because consumers do not have a fundamental right to obtain any food they wish. Here, I want to note for you the words right to bodily and physical health, access to foods of all kind, and no deeply rooted historical tradition. So again, we sort of held those words from 2010 to 2021 for our purposes today. Just try to hold on to those for a few minutes. So this also felt like another big whoosh, another strong wind, felling the notion that individuals, that is human beings, not corporate persons, do not have any fundamental right to access foods of all kind, or even a right to our own bodily and physical health. If it isn't articulated in writing and in law and codified, we don't have the rights that we might assume that we do. So even when good policy does get enacted, it can be undone unless we put it in writing and declare the right in the highest form of law in our Constitution. The constitutional framing of the right to food is a bulwark then to firmly enshrine the right, thereby informing and shoring up other statutes while protecting inherent rights. We set out to build that foundation on which those statutory walls could rest, though at the time we were working on building those too and didn't know what part would succeed first, if any at all. We set out to have a firm foundation for a house of food resilience that would stand the test of all time and also weather storms of all kinds. So I realize I keep using the words we and us, and our next section here is just going to talk a little bit about who were we. I keep using those pronouns, but who do I mean by them? And that just takes us into our next section here on collaborations and intersections.
So thanks for that, Heather. And I just want to reiterate that the thing that she was reading was a direct quote from the FDA a minute ago, that there's no absolute right to consume or feed children any particular food, blah, blah, blah. That this right to bodily and physical health is unavailing. That was a direct quote from a federal agency. And, you know, I was vaguely informed about this stuff. And so I got involved in 2016. My buddy, I have a good friend named Will Niels. He called me in late April of 2016. I actually still have his voicemail because it turned out to be a historical document. But he called me up to say that he thought Rockland was finally ready for a food sovereignty ordinance. And I'd kept half an eye on the food sovereignty movement ever since the state sued Dan Brown over unregulated raw milk sales in 2011. By 2016, I knew that many towns had passed ordinances, but I was unsure about what you might call consumer-led efforts, as I thought most ordinances were passed by producers at the time. Will, he told me I needed to meet the den mothers of the food sovereignty movement, Heather, and also Bonnie Preston. So I made sure to attend their talk at the Common Ground Fair in 2016. And Heather likes to tell me it was like a revival tent, okay? Because I'm in the back and I kept hooping and hollering in agreement, all, you know, all in support of this idea, you know. And my memory is that it was standing room only and I was standing there in the back. So we're going to say a lot more about this, but in a nutshell, food sovereignty ordinances exempt small scale producers from one size fits all corporate scale food regulations. It codifies the right of people to produce, harvest, and sell food right out of their kitchens to willing consumers. It took me about a year and a half of meeting with allies and city councilors in my town to explain the idea and to convince them that these ordinances would benefit the local food economy. Rockland City Council wouldn't pass it until the issue of state preemption was sorted, and they nominated me as the Rockland City representative to the legislature to argue on behalf of City Council in favor of food sovereignty. So after the Maine Food Sovereignty Act passed in 2017, which recognized the authority of municipalities to pass these ordinances, my city council unanimously passed the ordinance. Funny enough, it was actually against the advice of the city attorney at the time. Now, to be fair, the attorney was new to the job and new to the issue. But the reason council sided with me over the lawyer was based on the relationships that I had built with them city councilors and the convincing interpretations of law that I argued before them for years at this point. So the lesson here is, like, one of the lessons I want to offer is to make your relationships, make your legal interpretations, and steal your arguments, because it can have an effect. And we've already done a lot of that for you, and we're going to share some of those resources at the end.
Hearing Jesse whoop and holler from the back of that tent at the Common Ground Fair in 2016 felt like a revival, I guess, because Bonnie and I were preaching that day, and it was landing, and I don't believe maybe before or since I've ever talked about the right to food or food sovereignty or the local food ordinances and had anybody react in just that way before. So it was a sort of notable moment. So the story of how Bonnie and I got to that tent, however, started 6 years before that. And I just want to invite you to take a deep breath with me, like an inhale and an exhale, because we're going to take a quick sprinting romp in the next 5 minutes over 15 years of advocacy. And I'm only hitting highlights to share how we got from a farmhouse table in Penobscot to enshrining a right to food in our state constitution. So pictured with me here on this slide is Craig Hickman. At that time, he was a newly elected representative in Maine's House. The photo on the left was taken the day that we introduced the right to food for the first time to the Maine legislature. We're with Joel Salatin, a farming guru from Virginia. And the photo on the right is of us with Representative Billy Bob Falkingham, the final lead sponsor. And we were celebrating the victory of the right to food at the ballot box in 2021 at my local Grange, the Halcyon Grange. That story began in 2009. Now Senator Hickman was on his farm, me on mine. Both of us were facing livelihood disrupting changes in the rules about farming and food production that threatened to alter the farming landscape in Maine. Those interactions took us to 2011. I began working in my community to enact local law towards self-determination of our local food systems. And Craig Hickman ran for office to change state law towards self-determination of our local food systems. He would eventually be elected a state representative on his second run in 2013. Working with my community, our efforts to pass the local food and community self-governance ordinance had been successful at that time in 9 towns across Maine. Senator Hickman and I met for the first time in the office of Governor LePage, and after that began a beautiful working relationship. We drafted the first version of what later became the Maine Food Sovereignty Act. The public hearing for this lasted for more than 4 hours. It felt like church. Representative Hickman glowed afterwards. So from church in 2013 to that tent revival in 2016 to today, this work has always had a sacred element. That first effort failed in the legislature. By 2015, 6 more towns adopted the food sovereignty ordinance, and another legislative session had begun. Then Representative Hickman called one day, snowy day in January. Beware of snowy days when you're thinking about working on statutes. You may take off a little bit more than you could chew. But Craig said to me, let's go big. The FDA says we don't have the right to feed ourselves as we wish, and we don't have a right to our own bodily and physical health. So let's put it in writing, he said. Let's put it in the Constitution. The momentum was growing outside the state house as more towns were putting it in writing, but the state wasn't having it at that point. So at that very beginning point, we really set out just to change the conversation. We had no expectation of winning. But even in that session, by 2016, we kind of changed our minds as we went along, and we went all in. We rallied, we organized, we fought for it hard, and we lost hard. As Jesse mentioned before, we have lost more than we've won, and I just feel like that's an important thing to note at this point. But while we persevered, we also adapted. We continue still to run the marathon, but we also pass the baton. So this takes us to 2017. Pictured with me here was the strategic team that led us into our second attempt towards state recognition of food sovereignty. And on the right is my much younger family 10 years ago. Of course, they have also been key players throughout. This go-round in 2017 was a major lesson in adaptation, passing the baton and getting strategy savvy. On the left is Nikki Sakara of Community Water Justice, Betsy Gerald, the president of Food for Maine's Future, and my longtime partner in all things food sovereignty, traveling from town to town across the state, Bonnie Preston, on that first day of that year's legislative session. This was our second attempt at the food sovereignty bill, and we were down hard at this point after the previous losses. But by this time, Bonnie Preston and I had learned that lesson about winter brainstorming from Craig Hickman, and we decided to go big. We convinced each other to include water sovereignty in our 2017 attempt at a food sovereignty bill. We asked then Senate Minority Leader Troy Jackson to sponsor the bill. That was a big adaptation, that passing of the baton. It was called an act to recognize local control of food and water systems. Water was stripped out of the bill immediately. Then Representative Hickman took up a strong lead in the House, and together with Senator Jackson as lead in the Senate, this time we won. The state recognized municipal authority over local food exchanges, and for the first time, traditional foodways was defined in statute. This gave us a strong headwind going into the legislative session in 2019. This would be Representative Hickman's last term in the legislature, or so we thought. And we put our heads together once again to draft an improved, revised version of the right to food. Try again. The day it finally came to the floor of the House for a vote in 2020, the legislature adjourned because of the pandemic, and it would die between legislative sessions. When the legislature reconvened in 2021, Representative Billy Bob Falkingham took up the baton and led the right to food through the Maine House. Meanwhile, District 14 Senator Shenna Bellows ran for the position of Secretary of State, vacating her seat in the Senate, a seat Craig Hickman was encouraged to campaign for. He won in a special election that year and shepherded the right to food masterfully through the Senate. We needed 2/3 supermajorities in both chambers to send it to the people of Maine to vote on. The momentum outside the State House continued to grow, More towns are passing the local food and community self-governance ordinance every year, and more of those advocates were ready to engage with their senators and reps urging passage. So we all got to vote on it at the ballot box in 2021, and it passed there with a 61% majority, enshrining it in our Constitution's Declaration of Rights.
So one thing I'd like to point out is that this work transcends traditional party politics. And there is also resonance of grassroots advocacy with town councilors, with legislators, and champions within the state apparatus, like Heather said, like Craig and Troy and Billy Bob. We like to call this a process of horizontal diffusion resulting in vertical integration. So think of individuals and municipalities as the rhizome or mycelium spreading underground throughout the geography of the state. And then once a critical mass of communities pass these ordinances, then a fruiting body or a tree emerges as that vertical integration. Deep roots of this tree need to spread horizontally so that the trunk and the canopy of the tree can remain strong. So this is a strategy that it both leverages, but it's also dependent on local as well as vertical efforts. So to begin, it's critical to recognize that the LFSGO, the local food and community self-governance ordinance, colloquially, I just call them food sovereignty ordinance. Okay, the municipal ordinance things. It's important to recognize that it is based in rights-based law, which is substantively, and I dare say paradigmatically, different from regulatory law. Okay. But as municipalities across the land asserted their rights to design and determine the terms of local food transactions, there became a need for integration with state agencies and their policies. The first example of vertical integration was the Maine Food Sovereignty Act, followed by the history-making Right to Food constitutional amendment. So it's kind of like, again, there's individual actors who hustled this idea in their municipalities, and as it spread throughout across the landscape, it was municipality by municipality until so many municipalities had these ordinances on the books that state agencies had to adjust and incorporate. Okay, so I just want to give you this picture of both a rhizome, horizontal diffusion that results in this vertical integration in law. Okay, so $5 words incoming. Get ready. Okay, so perhaps you can see now that this strategy is multi-scalar. Okay, that leverages both local and vertical efforts. In this instance, there's a resonance between grassroots advocacy and state level policy. As organisms, we transcend and include what has come before in what is properly called a holarchy. It implies higher levels just without the oppression commonly associated with the similar concept of hierarchy. Okay, so there's levels, but it's inclusive. It's not oppressive. Okay, just like in your cells, transcend and include molecules, but that's not an oppressive thing. So this is properly called a holarchy. Okay, so the food sovereignty movement is multiscalar. It involves local, state, national, and international aspects. It's integrated across the governmental branches, executive, legislative, and judicial. And within this rights-based framework, we exercise our sovereignty as engaged citizens to build a positive vision of a local food system, rather than trying to force the nanny state to regulate corporate actors who have often captured regulatory agencies at higher levels of government anyways. So to drive this point home, this is our preference for how different scales of governance should work. Okay. Vertical policy integration transcends and includes local municipal ordinances. Individuals find their allies and work to pass food sovereignty ordinances within their communities. The state legislature recognizes the authority of those towns to determine their food systems. And this right to food freedom is further strengthened by the right to food constitutional amendment. As a contrast, within a regulatory framework coupled with a capitalist commodity food system, corporate capture of regulatory agencies are too common, resulting in one-size-fits-all policies that favor large-scale corporate actors and push out small-scale producers. Rights-based law has the potential to work radically different.
Which takes us to where did Maine's right to food come from? And it is rooted in food sovereignty principles. When a small group of us were sitting around my farmhouse kitchen table, we set ourselves down in 2010. It was to respond to a problem of democracy that had landed with a loud thump in our dooryard. The long reach of that industrial corporate food dragon had come to Quill's End. I had never laid eyes on this definition of food sovereignty before then, but I was learning with urgent clarity and necessity to assert food sovereignty. That dragon had also come to Annabessacook Farm, though neither Craig Hickman or I knew each other then. It looked like small changes in poultry regulations and dairy rules, but it smelled like disappearing farms and empty rural places. So I gathered farmers and farm workers and farm customers around me to address the problem locally. Craig gathered his courage and he ran for state office. And it would take 3 more years for our physical paths to intersect, but our shared work had already begun. And I just really think that mycelial network that Jesse is talking about is just the most apt way to talk about how this is all moved over time, sort of invisibly, but tangibly. So that story of how Craig and I came to work together will remain for a different time, but the solutions that we reached for are really the matter at hand here. The central problem was named in this declaration of food sovereignty from Nyaleni. We'd lost the power to define ourselves and our food and agriculture systems. We desperately needed to reclaim that authority. And we needed to put those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of our food system rather than the demands of markets and corporations. We sought locally to answer these 3 central questions. Who was making the decisions about food and agricultural policy right now? What were the relationships that we wanted to have with each other in our communities? And how could we encode that into law? So in Penobscot, over the course of 2010, 5 of us across 4 towns drafted the local food and community self-governance ordinance, a rights-based ordinance. In 2011, 4 towns adopted it. This became the proverbial shot across the bow. And in it, we asserted an inherent right to self-governance rooted in Maine state constitution. We laid out in municipal law that our local food system must, quote, fundamentally respect human dignity and health, nourish individuals and community, and sustain producers, processors, and the environment. And we articulated the first iteration of a right to food, quote, that all individuals have a natural, inherent, and unalienable right to acquire, produce, process, prepare, preserve, and consume the food of their own choosing for their own nourishment and sustenance. Furthermore, that all individuals have a right to barter, trade, and purchase food, and to save and exchange seed from the sources of their own choosing for their own physical health and well-being. And finally, we exempted direct food exchanges between food producers and processors from state licensing and inspection, thereby reclaiming the jurisdiction to define ourselves and our traditional foodways. So why does this matter? It would take 6 years from the passage of those first local ordinances for the state to recognize the legal authority we had asserted. And that was by no means a done deal or a sure thing. In 2017, the Maine Food Sovereignty Act was enacted, requiring that the state recognize our local authority over the direct exchanges of food, recognizing that it was up to the communities of Maine to determine how our food needs are met. It would take, and is still taking, a number of amendments over the next 8 years to codify the language for Maine's communities into state law. And that brings us to the present legislative session and a bill called LD 124, an act to protect the right to food. While the Maine Food Sovereignty was enacted in 2017, because of the political realities of that moment, neither the definition in the previous slide nor the principles of food sovereignty exist in statute yet. LD 124, before the legislature now, puts Maine's articulation of both definition and the principles into statute. And it also contains other implementation goals and policy objectives of the right to food. And I'm happy to report to you all that it has enjoyed, I would say, a unanimous ought to pass vote from the Committee on Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry. And that's where it is in the legislative process right now, and hopefully soon will be on the floor of the Senate for a vote. So why does that matter? Last year, some of you are probably aware, was the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The spirit of universal human rights always begins in humble places, accessible to all citizens, like the home and the workplace, not in international bodies or local, state, or federal governments. That transcendence that Jesse was speaking about may come to incorporate all those levels. Be nice if it worked as organically and cellularly as that, but it's necessary to remember that it started on farms with ordinary individuals coming together to ensure dignity, nourishing sustenance, and self-determination. This is a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt holding the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In a speech about that document in 1958, she said these words, which I hold close to heart, and I just want to share with you all. The direct quote: "Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in, the school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity, without discrimination. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world."
All right, ladies and gentlemen. So now we're going to get into the main course to, deepen our understanding. And Heather, I guess I'd like to pick up the pace a little bit and try to, get through what we have in like 20 minutes or something, so we allow enough time for good discussion with everybody. So let's continue.
Okay, so now we're getting into the actual text of the right to food, what it is, what does it mean, and how do we use it? Maine's Right to Food Amendment builds a human rights framework to protect essential freedoms and secure the rights of people, while cautiously guarding against abuse of public lands, natural resources, and private property. What does Article 25 say? What does it mean? How do we exercise this right? This main course discussion is going to explore these questions, highlighting potential policy implications. So essential to answering these questions is defining Maine's right to food amendment, to deepen our understanding, exercise this right, and to broaden implementation. Maine's right to food can best be understood by examining the single sentence in 4 clauses. The first clause is the place where the human right to food is enshrined. This is the universal human right recognized in international law, but with a Maine spin. Quote, all individuals have a natural, inherent, and unalienable right to food. The first clause can be further broken down into the 4 components on this slide, that food be adequate, available, accessible, and sustainable. The second clause is an articulation of food sovereignty, quote, including the right to save and exchange seed. The third clause, including the right to grow, raise, harvest, produce, and consume the food of their choosing for their own nourishment, sustenance, bodily health, and well-being, is an articulation of food freedom. And the fourth clause, as long as an individual does not commit trespassing, theft, poaching, or other abuses of private property rights, public lands, or natural resources in the harvesting, production, or acquisition of food. This is a limiting clause that includes an articulation of a constraint of that right. So as we tuck into this main course, it's significant to note that Maine's right to food is both a universal human right and also an individual liberty right, each expressed in its distinct place in this one sentence that has placed Maine in a singular position of leadership in the United States, enshrining the right to food in the highest form of law. The first clause is includes that food must be adequate, meaning that food is of quantity and quality to meet nutritional needs, free from adverse substances, and acceptable culturally. Importantly, it provides the ability to feed oneself in dignity. Dignity, in this sense, means that people are not being forced to make trade-offs, choosing between one essential component of life or another. An example of that is that a reliance on charity limits food options and the ability to acquire foods from a place of choosing for one's own nourishment, sustenance, bodily health, and well-being. A right to food requires that a person either be able to feed themselves directly from the land or other natural resources, or be able to acquire or purchase adequate food. The government role is not to provide food, but rather to protect this right by respecting, facilitating, and promoting. This means gradually over time working toward full realization. Notable here is that it should primarily be understood as a tool for us, the people, to utilize and exercise, not for governments to grant or provide. Considering other enumerated rights in our Declaration of Rights in Maine, it includes the right to bear arms, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. The government does not give people guns. It does not prescribe speech or religious preference. If it does, a constitutional right means that people have legal standing in court to defend the enshrined right. Next is availability. For food to be available, individuals must have access to productive resources. So natural resources for growers, basic agricultural resources for food growth. At minimum, food is available for purchase. There must be a well-functioning food distribution system that food can be transported from point A to B. Individuals have the right to acquire food from the land or other natural resources, or through a supply and demand system that allows food to be acquired and consumed. Notable here is that this can inform public policy around land access, housing, transportation, wages, seeds, and it underscores the necessity of clean water, air, and soils for food production. The next part of the first clause is that food should be both economically and physically accessible. That just means that food must be accessible to physically vulnerable, to infants, elderly, physically disabled, terminally ill, and mentally ill, to victims of natural disasters, to indigenous peoples. It should be economically accessible, meaning that the cost of food does not compromise other standards of living, that there are no trade-offs between making rent and acquiring food, and that community-based and state-level social contract supports should negate existing trade-offs. Thought seeds here for policymakers: wages proportional to pay for life expenses, land access, food deserts, clean water, soil, air. It is notable here as well that the accessibility in this first part of the constitutional amendment includes access to land, clean water, air, and soil to ensure the ability to grow, raise, harvest, produce, and consume food. And the last component of this first clause is sustainability. The food should be sustainable for the environment, having minimal negative impact on the environment. For our health, it should be nutritious for current people and future generations. For our communities, encouraging local production and distribution, and for future generations. This portion of Maine's right to food works closely in concert with the fourth clause, which is the limiting and constraint clause protecting public lands and other natural resources. The second clause of our right to food amendment is about ensuring Maine's food security in the face of supply chain disruptions and volatile weather exchanges. This is the clause including the right to save and exchange seeds. It's vital to regional food resilience, needed to strengthen communities in the face of climate disruption and other emergencies that make community food supplies vulnerable. It's essential for people to retain this ability, apart from corporate patenting, to save and exchange seeds as microclimates and bioregions change over time. And it allows seeds to adapt to local changing environments, ensuring the ability of people to preserve that emerging genetic diversity. The third clause is the Food Freedom Clause, the right to grow, raise, harvest, produce, and consume the food of their choosing for their own nourishment, sustenance, bodily health, and well-being. Right to food implies self-determination, agency, and dignity. This clause ensures that Maine people will always retain the autonomy to choose foods to nourish health. The government's role here is to respect and protect the right by restraining its own agencies or third-party actors that interfere with our individual ability to grow, raise, harvest, produce, and consume food. The fourth clause, language, as the protection against abuse. It affirms our role, people's roles as stewards of nature, and limits the protected liberties named in the amendment by explicitly constraining the right. Maine's articulation of the right to food is a practicable application of human rights principles and also a careful balance of individual freedoms and universal human rights. So this right to food in Maine now stands as a legal lens to view Maine statutes for extractive industries, for example. Otherwise, all regular rules and regulations remain in force. The right to food is not an invitation to break the laws of Maine. Importantly, this language should be understood in its common everyday usage and not to be construed in a way that is more restrictive. As many of you probably know, over time when you work in law, that words don't always mean what you think they mean when they get to court. So that piece is an important one. And then that is, closing out that section on the language. If you change the food system, you change everything. We've talked a fair bit about the importance of working at many scales of governance, creating a spiral model of change. Our experience has been that working at the smallest scale and growing outwards and then upwards has created a bigger shift over time than trying to like throw our pebbles at this federal fortress. In this photo, we have represented the international level with the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right to food, Michael Fakhri. We have the state level represented with Senator Craig Hickman and myself at the local level, all very important different points of pressure that can be brought to bear to bring about systemic change. And then there's also the national level. And right now, the exciting thing that's happening is that there has formed in the last several years a national right to food community of practice. We gathered last year in Syracuse, where this picture came from, and I wanted to share with you the encouragement that Michael Fakhri shared with us that day, because it really was for all of Maine. He told us that the whole world is looking at Maine. No one ever thought that the right to food could be enshrined anywhere in the United States. And now Maine has done it. He repeated to us several times, "You have done the impossible." Bonnie and I would often encourage each other in those beginning years and all those frustrating moments with words from Nelson Mandela that it's always impossible until it's done. And now this moment has arrived when the world's foremost advocate on the right to food is telling Maine that we've done the impossible and that the world is watching to see how we exercise and implement this. And I just want to share with you his nutshell version of the right to food. He said, at its simplest form, the right to food is people's ability to access good food through their relationship with the land or through fair and stable markets. The right to food also means that people have the right to decide as a community what counts as good food and what is nutritious, healthy, culturally appropriate, or ecologically sustainable. To be free from hunger is to be free from exploitation and to be free from oppression. So in Maine, this is what this looks like right now. A wonderful food sovereignty advocate, right food advocate, Dan Davis from Oxford County, put these maps and charts together. The map on the left represents what I find to be a beautiful visible patchwork quilt of how food sovereignty has spread across the state, often encompassing the right to food. Every county in the state has at least one town that has protected its food sovereignty with a local ordinance. And the chart on the right just shows by county how many towns in that county have passed these local ordinances. You can see that if you can see that print, but Aroostook County and Oxford County lead the state with 17 towns each. And maybe you can find your county on that chart and just get a visual of like how the food sovereignty zone is spreading, connecting town to town, city to city, UT to UT across Maine. These ordinances now encompass 35% of Maine's towns, representing 366,000 people. To me, that represents the potential to increase our food resilience exponentially, as growing more food necessitates more investment in food processing, storing, and distribution infrastructure. And most importantly to me is that as more food is grown in Maine through these community-based models of production, relationships deepen around the exchanging of food. This includes bartering, trading, and a host of other traditional food ways. But that involves education, sharing food preparation and growing knowledge, and strengthening the kind of relational networks that really hold the state together during hard times like we are in right now.
So let's talk about this takeout bag now. So even if you don't totally grok the paradigmatic difference between a rights-based ordinance and a regulatory legislative law, please take home the notion that you need to pass a food sovereignty ordinance in your town. This is the LFSGO, the LFCSGO. Let's FGO, the local food community self-governance ordinance, the food sovereignty ordinance. Those still need to be passed in all the towns. The higher levels of law are there to support the local ordinances, but the ordinance is the primary vehicle to achieve food sovereignty. And again, it does this by codifying in local ordinance the right of people to grow and exchange food and seeds. So this sets the stage for direct me to thee transactions between producers and willing consumers. It lowers the bar of entry into food production by allowing your small scale actors to exchange food directly with a customer base. And it sets the stage for local food exchange systems within towns by removing the one size fits all regulations aimed at those large scale corporate actors. It's different than charity programs, which buy food from large producers and then distribute it. Instead, these ordinances protect the rights of producers to feed their neighbors in dignity and self-determination. And these ordinances enshrine a right for people to implement. This is a right for us as people to exercise and for the policymakers to respect. Policymakers are the duty bearers to promote, protect, fulfill, and respect those rights. But again, it's not a requirement for the government to do much. It's primarily for us as people to implement. So again, go home and pass a food sovereignty ordinance in your town. As it says here, the state and constitutional laws necessarily work in tandem with these municipal ordinances, and the ordinances continue to be primary. There's a dual use here. The right to food both constrains government from infringing on our basic rights, but it also compels the government to uphold this legal framework. It's grounded in freedom by way of a constitutional right, but in order to be effective, it needs a framework of law that balances constitutional, legislative, and municipal levels of law. So remember that multi-scalar bit about how the right to food is vertically integrated between levels of government and also horizontally diffuse across the landscape town by town. To preempt a common question, given the current status of the colonial, corporate, global food commodity-based system, how do we actually get to food sovereignty? And I'll encourage folks to take a long view of history here. This is multi-generational work. Okay, it took us a couple hundred years to build the food system that we have now that's not working all the time for everybody. And it might take a few generations to claw the food system back from the globalist and corporate douchebags. So there's a tension between state, market, and commons here. And this is an attempt at situating food as a commons. Okay. But as a people, we've largely forgotten how to common. So it'll probably take some time to remember how to do that. There's no instant gratification here. We're not going to push buttons and have this happen as fast as the internet. So please go home, pass an ordinance in your town, call your reps, have them support LD 124. But it sounds like that's actually doing pretty good too. So many folks in this crowd, they might be more likely to dig the universal human rights aspect. And we should note that there are others from what you might call a right-leaning orientation who also dig this work from the individual civil rights perspective. So just know that there can be some friction there, and focus on the common ground of agency, dignity, and freedom in your work, in your towns. So, it's important to use skillful means and discernment when you're communicating with your neighbors who might hold different opinions. I'd encourage you to practice your code switching to talk up food freedom to some and economic, social, and cultural rights to others when the situation warrants. Like I wrote some talking points, and if you're talking to some liberal-minded people, you might talk up the sustainability, ecological aspects. And if you're talking to a more conservative leaning person, you're going to talk up it lowers the barrier of entry into the market, supports small business, freedom, and so on. But so, in other words, come for the freedom, stay for the human rights.
We want to close with a poem near and dear to my heart that brings us all to the table, that shares the commons Jesse was talking about. I've read as a testimony to legislative committee and over again to remind myself why we do this work and what's at stake. It's a poem, Perhaps the World Ends Here, by Joy Harjo, who is a Muskogee Nation citizen and the first Native American United States Poet Laureate. Perhaps the world ends here. The world begins at a kitchen table. No matter what, we must eat to live. The gifts of earth are brought and prepared, set on the table. So it has been since creation, and it will go on. We chase chickens or dogs away from it. Babies teethe at the corners. They scrape their knees under it. It is here that children are given instructions on what it means to be human. We make men at it. We make women. At this table, we gossip, recall enemies, and the ghosts of lovers. Our dreams drink coffee with us as they put their arms around our children. They laugh with us at our poor falling down selves and as we put ourselves back together once again at the table. This table has been a house in the rain, an umbrella in the sun. Wars have begun and ended at this table. It is a place to hide in the shadow of terror, a place to celebrate the terrible victory. We have given birth on this table and have prepared our parents for burial here. At this table, we sing with joy, with sorrow. We pray of suffering and remorse. We give thanks. Perhaps the world will end at the kitchen table while we are laughing and crying, eating of the last sweet bite. So from that last sweet bite, and before our discussion dessert time together, some resources for you, including the local, state, and national levels. The Local Food and Community Self-Governance Ordinance is on the Local Food Rules website. Another take home, I guess, is the supporting of the LD 124 that we've talked about to call the legislators in your districts. We have linked here the National Right to Food Community of Practice website. This is a group gathered of people across the country, and every month there are teach-ins, learning and shared experience times to join in and join a national conversation about the right to food, learn what other people are doing in other places. I wanted to let you know that we are also working on a publication due out in 2025 called Food is Life, a glossary of the right to food in Maine, with the potential of community-sponsored events in 2026. And in the meantime, we've linked a more in-depth kind of dive into the right to food in Maine with the Maine Law Review article that I co-authored with Fotini Campitelli Suarez, who's here today. Hi, Fotini. And Professor Denise Cordova Montez. And there's a link to that article here as well.
All right, cool. So we're about to break for dessert and then have like coffee and discussion. As a reminder, I just kind of want to flag some of these questions to ponder as we head forward into the discussion. How do we exercise this right? What are violations of the right? How do we protect it? What are you all hoping to take away from this session? But we thank you for your patience in hanging in there with us while we spin some of these yarns. And I want to take a boogie break. Let's take a boogie break for 5 minutes, and then we'll come back to the Zoom room.
I took a screenshot of the map of Maine, broken out by the counties. And so folks want to see that in more detail. I sent the screenshot, but you can't see it super well. So if anybody, like Jesse, if you can share the presentation or just share that map with folks where they can zoom in more, that was requested. And other than that, we don't have any questions in the chat, but we have one in prompt.
Perhaps you could just tell us what the keys mean, because that was the part we couldn't read. The keys on the map part.
The keys?
Here, I'll share my screen real quick and show what you're talking about.
Oh, that was, yeah.
So the keys down here, the green, darker green and the lighter green. What those mean?
Oh, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So I think the green is municipalities that have a food sovereignty ordinance on the books. What's the light green mean, Heather? Is that just a unorganized territory or slightly different designation, or what does the light green mean?
Those may be communities that are considering adopting the ordinance. And at this point, there are one of the amendments to the Maine Food Sovereignty Act was to allow UTs and plantations in Maine don't have a level of governance except for county. So one of the amendments to the Maine Food Sovereignty Act was to allow counties to pass a countywide local food ordinance. And the two counties that have done that right now are Aroostook and Oxford. And that may also be what those what that part of the patchwork quilt is.
Oh, got it. That was going to be my question. Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right. So I'm kind of moderating this. Is that right, Jesse and Heather? Should I?
That'd be great.
Okay, great. So Chelsea, why don't you jump in here?
Thank you. I lowered my hand and forgot to unmute myself. Thank you so much for that. That was such a wonderful overview and yeah, just really, really interesting. So I'm Chelsea. I work for the National Right to Food Community of Practice, but I'm a human rights practitioner and I'm based here in Maine. And when all of this was happening, I was doing work in Scotland to get a right to food piece of legislation passed in Scotland. And so I just want to reiterate the point that Heather made, that Michael Fackery had said to you, that the world was so excited when this happened in Maine, and we were so interested to see it come about in the US. And it wasn't just that I was a Maine resident or a Mainer myself living abroad doing this work. Like, everybody was really interested to see it. So it's really exciting. And I'm glad to be here and hearing a little bit more about it. But Jesse, I just wanted to say, I really like the way that you've sort of talked about and unpacked the difference between human rights frameworks and regulatory frameworks. And I know it's a little bit nerdy, but I also think it's super helpful and great. And I wanted to just encourage everybody to think in terms of the work that you're doing about, no matter what sort of sector or part of the food system you come from, to think about the types of legislation, the types of regulations that are constraining or supporting the right to food being realized in the work that you do, whether that's, so it might be through a food sovereignty ordinance, and absolutely do all the work that we can to get those into as many places across Maine as possible. But if you're sitting here and thinking, well, the work I do is actually in school meals, Heather sort of did this really great piece where she articulated what the right to food means in that first clause that we have in our constitutional amendment now. And that can play out in so many different spheres. So it's just a sort of an invitation to encourage you to think, like, So, for example, in school meals, if we wanted to take that as the example, to think, okay, what would the right to food look like here, and what are the sort of regulations that are helping to promote that or not helping to promote that, and how could I do that work within my sphere of influence? So we have in Maine also a commitment to universal free school meals, which only 8 other states do. But with budget cuts at the minute, some of that can be put at risk. And some of the things that are happening at federal level are putting our own commitments to children's access to the food that they need through schools at risk. So how can we start how can we start using the language of the right to food as it sits in our Constitution? We're the only state in the country that has the ability to do that, in the articulation of all of the work that we're doing in each of our spheres of influence. So just a sort of invitation to think about that.
Thanks, Chelsea. Yeah, and I have a question for you, Chelsea, too, but go ahead, Heather. I see your hand up.
Yeah, well, I just want to pick up on that point, Chelsea. I'm really glad that you brought that up about the school lunches and the USD funding being frozen, because it is actually an exciting way that the right to food was brought to bear. So our Attorney General, as many of you probably know, sued the federal government because of the freezing of the USDA funding for school lunches, but also one of those unique places or in policy where it's helping both farmers and people who need food, of a farm to school network, and that the funding for the education on that was also frozen. But the Attorney General cited Maine's right to food, and that it was violating the right to food of children in Maine to freeze that funding. So it was, I think, now the third example of the right to food being justiciable, or being having legal standing in court to make a legal argument that, like Chelsea said, no other state can make that argument, but Maine did, and Maine prevailed, and the USDA funding was unfrozen, or at least was, I think, mandated to be unfrozen. I'm not sure if that's playing out, but the right to food was brought into that case.
Oh, Maine, man. So Chelsea, I do have a question for you, but maybe it'll come up as part of other folks' questions. So I'll give other people a minute if you have anything else you want to add to the discussion or ask Jesse, Heather, Chelsea, or each other, then go for it. Go ahead, Jim. I knew you're going to raise your hand, Jim. Go ahead.
I mean, I am so proud to be living in Maine and feeling part of this, doing food system work for 30 plus years, and really feeling like the place where our food system is most broken is where we limit access. We oppress people's right to food. And so, for example, Chelsea, when you talk about the school meals, we have universal meals, and we have many Muslim students who couldn't eat those meals. So you're hearing during the Convergence about our efforts to have halal school meals, so that students have food that meets their cultural needs. So, I mean, there's some policies that happen kind of within the district level. It sets a trend. It creates access to that food right that we universally created with universal school meals in our state. So, I mean, there's a lot of ways it could be implemented. I've struggled to get my head around how we leverage this to have the most impact. So, Heather, I was really glad to hear that we were able to use it to challenge the federal government's withholding of funds for school meals. I kind of laughed and was kind of disappointed when the first real lawsuit that came out was, I want to hunt on Sundays. And I really appreciated, Jesse, your Venn diagram about the individual liberty rights, that distinction versus the universal human rights and kind of where they intersect. But again, I mean, I'm still, and I don't know if it's a totally coherent question, but I'm just continuing to struggle how we best leverage what we've done to promote this human right, to make sure that people don't go hungry, especially in this moment as Congress sits there ready to cut significant benefits for people who are already struggling to put enough food on their table. So, yeah, I wasn't really aware how it was used, Heather, for the school meal, so I was happy to learn about that. And I'm a student and continue to want to learn more how we can advocate.
Love that. Yeah, I certainly recognize your name, and I'm happy to see you here, Jim. And um, I sort of share your sentiment about the first court case that came up in Maine, but some exciting things came out of that in a way. The argument that we've made is the one that I mentioned about the language should not be construed to be more restrictive than its meaning, and in that particular case, that harvest does include hunting, for example, and also foraging. So the court, even though they said that the right to food is not being violated to ban hunting on Sundays. It did some really important things. It recognized that the right to food is justiciable, that people have legal standing to use it in court at our highest level in our state, in the Maine Supreme Court. So that was a big win, I think, by that being kind of forced in a way that felt a little premature. And then they also just agreed on that point that the language in the Right to Food Amendment shouldn't be like contrived to mean things that are more restrictive than how we commonly use language. And they did a really similar thing of just citing Merriam-Webster. Like there are actually common definitions in how we all use language. So there were some I think wins for the right to food in that case that can be pulled out now and used in other ways to leverage it, as you're mentioning.
So, Jim, part of your question is like, how can we jump on board and advocate, right? And so that goes well with my question, Chelsea. We talked a while ago about the event in Syracuse, is that right? That seemed to be like a big movement builder. And I'm wondering if you could just speak about that for a couple of minutes to give folks an idea of what kinds of movement building events have happened, just to like spark ideas or inspiration or whatever.
Sure. And I just want to recognize that, of course, Heather was one of the founding members of the community of practice. So she's, really well placed to speak to this as well. But I will say in direct response to Jim's question, it's also just another invitation to think of ways outside of the court system that we can really be claiming our rights, that we are, Heather and Jesse have both sort of made the case for one of the reasons for, one of the things that's great about having the right to food here is that we all now have a role in moving this forward and implementing this and putting this into practice every day. And so it's not just about looking, there will be opportunities to take some cases, and that is an important sort of mechanism for state accountability and sometimes a way that, especially in the US, things are done. But we can just start taking ownership of the language and using that in all the places where decisions are made. So whether that's at your school district level, whether that's at your town count, in your town, in your city, in any sort of policy decision or any sort of decision that's being taken, we can start using the language and claiming the language in those discussions. So for advocating at all levels, I suppose. But Annie, the event I think that you were talking about in Syracuse, and one happened previously in Miami, which I wasn't a part of, but Heather, you might have been at the Miami one, was a People's Tribunal, and it's a model that has been used in many places around the world, but the community of practice has run 2 of them now, and it's primarily an opportunity it's not a legal tribunal, it's not through an actual court, but it's sort of an opportunity for people who are citizens or residents of a particular area to come and speak their own experience and speak their truths about the issues that are happening in that space. And so for the group in Syria, and then to be heard by a panel of experts. So again, not a legal panel, but a panel of people who have expertise in that particular area, and just for the community, but also for decision makers in the space to be able to hear and witness and bear witness to the realities of people's real lives in that situation. And so it's a method or a tool that the community of practice has used in a couple of different places and will continue to support other people to use to be able to articulate what the current state of rights realization or lack thereof is in a particular space, and just kind of generate a space for inviting people to hear what's happening and hopefully creating a kind of statement of some sort of accountability or a declaration that is used to forward decision making in that space. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Chelsea. Heather or Jesse, do you want to add anything to that? Does that feel complete enough?
I would just really second that. The tribunals in both places were so powerful and really deeply profound. In Miami, the intersection was with housing. So if you don't have a house, it's really hard to have a right to food. And Miami had been enacting and still is really, and Fotini, you chime in if I missed something here, ordinances to ban public feeding. So it would fine the people who were driving to locations with food for hungry people, for homeless people. It would fine them. And so then the homeless community was rallying around the people that are providing food. And they were, doing these pop-ups and it's the tribunal brought together and shone a light on just the awfulness of these experiences. And city councilors come, and sometimes the press comes, and it just makes the violations so visible and so powerfully felt. And then in at Syracuse, similarly, I think there were officials from their Department of Agriculture, and just really moving and touching and powerful. And those are things that people can do anywhere to shine a light on what's happening in your community. And certainly the National Right to Food Community Practice is a good place to, kind of talk to about how to structure that. But those are really powerful tools to bring to bear.
Thank you, Heather, so much. And Fatini for putting to folks see the chat. There's a couple of links that help, I believe, describe those tribunals more. So thanks, Fatini. Taylor, would you pipe in, and can you tell us where you're coming in from too?
Yeah, I'm in Northwest Michigan in Traverse City.
Cool.
Yeah, so great to be here. Thanks so much for your presentation. I was curious, in like the rights-based approach, there's a lot of times where the charitable food system is called out, and understandably so is called out today too. But I was curious if you found successes with nonprofits or charitable organizations that supported your efforts, and why you think you had those successes, and how that worked.
Actually, the opposite was true, Taylor.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, much to our surprise and chagrin, actually. But when we were campaigning in 2021 for the right to food, it had been a years-long effort, as we mentioned at that point, and but that doesn't mean that we were building up a kind of a war chest of cash. So that's really not been part of the whole thing. So we didn't really have campaign money. And we're very much from June when it came out of the legislature, we had till November of that same year to really organize around it. And surprisingly, there was opposition that had never really engaged in the process for the previous 6 years that included animal rights organizations, which we didn't even touch on today, and we don't really need to. But during that campaign, we did make some briefer presentations with the help of some of the colleagues from the National Right to Food Community of Practice to the Good Shepherd Food Bank here, which is our statewide food bank. And they opted to not support the right to food, and not oppose it, but also not to support it publicly. So that was a bit of a disappointment. But it hasn't been. It's not uncommon to us throughout this. When we first started advocating for food sovereignty, our organic farming organization also didn't support. Eventually, they did support the right to food. So it takes time, like Jesse was saying, this multi-generational effort to turn these ships around. And often on those boards of those food banks, as I'm sure you know, are individuals with conflicts of interest when we're talking about loosening the reins and having a more autonomous food system with agency and dignity. That can be at cross purposes with different people who serve on the board. So without, wanting to speculate too much on what the motivations might be, there are just certain things that are visible and other big questions that remain about, like, why wouldn't they support the right to food? So we did not have that support, but we've always sort of continued forward and keep the doors open and hope that the support comes along when it will. And it's only been 4 years, since, and sort of just a little sand in the hourglass of time here, that it's really just beginning to be discussed and talked about, in forums like this where people haven't been considering it before. So
I had assumed I didn't phrase my question well. I had assumed that you wouldn't get support, so that's why
okay.
So I was asking if you found success, if you did have any success.
Yeah.
But it sounds tricky. I mean, the same thing would go here, I think, in Michigan, but there's coalitions of other organization, charitable food organizations.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
It kind of, I mean, it's the surprising kind of phenomenon of agency capture, isn't it? Like we can understand that state or federal agencies have been captured by corporate actors, but it sounds to me like these captains of industry that would try to tie up food as only a commodity to keep it on lockdown. It's not beyond their ability to discern that it would be in their best interest to also serve on these boards of nonprofits and charities and whatnot. So it just reminds me of the agency capture phenomenon.
Okay, so we are coming to a close here, everybody. I have like so many more questions. So I'm just going to give myself the advice to check out the Right to Food Community of Practice, where a lot of those other questions can be explored and answered. And would one of you just put that in the chat one more time? I think you did already, but if you could do it, that would be great. I want to thank Heather and Jesse for all of your time and real, heartfelt effort to put this beautifully together, and for everybody else to be here. Even if we, have a small handful of people here, we know that this can spread, the ripples really far and wide, and for many generations to come. So thanks for being here. And even folks come in, Fatini from outside of Maine and Taylor from outside of Maine. It's really exciting to see that this is spreading far and wide. So thank you. And Lauren and I are going to take you out for the next 2 minutes with just a little bit more information, and then we'll let y'all go for real main course or takeout or dessert or whatever it is that you're going to get next. Okay, so I'm going to run through this real quick, kind of on high speed so we can get through this. If you don't mind to take just, it's like 2 minutes, a brief survey. I'm going to put it in the chat, all these things in the chat right now, so that we can just keep doing better and better as time goes on. We would really appreciate it. Thank you. Go ahead, Lauren. We do have 3 more virtual workshops coming up in the next 2 days. No, anyway, maybe 2 more. No, we have 3 more. Anyway, there's one coming up today called Dollars and Cents, Finding the Right Money for Your Vision, really geared towards anybody and everybody in the food system who is looking for investment or somehow to sustain their enterprise, their business, their efforts. And then we have a special edition here. When government fails us, community care networks bail us, sharing resources to meet the moment. So really talking about like, all right, the system is failing us. What are we doing on the ground at each kitchen table, right? Like Heather was talking about, to meet the needs of our people right now. So it's like a round table. Come share what you're doing with other people and share what your calls to action are. We then have the May 29th in-person party, common party and lots of learning. So, and meeting people and connecting. So registration is still open. Check it out. It's in the chat. Please register if you are able and wanting to come. And again, of course, there's stipends for everything you could need. And you can fill out a stipend form and we will meet your request. And then the collective action mural is in the chat again. If you were inspired to do something or an idea came up for you, please put it in the mural so other folks can see it and connect with you about your thoughts and actions. If you are interested in anything related to the Maine Food Convergence Project, there's an interest form. Check it out. Show us what you're interested in. We will get back to you within a couple weeks probably. And last but not least, we have a post-event gathering on June 12th at 4 o'clock. Link is in the chat to register. This is basically where we say, all right, we learned so much. We connected with people. What's next? Where are the gaps? What do we need to do to meet the needs of today collectively? So come if you can. We'd love to have you there from wherever you are. And that is it, everybody. Have a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining us. And we hope we see you again soon. Take care.